It is our great pleasure to have Lance Keimig as tonight's guest speaker. Lance is a Massachusetts-based photographer who is best known for his nocturnal images, which are made at the junction of the built and natural environments. His book, Night Photography: Finding Your Way in the Dark, was published by Focal Press in 2010 and has been translated into 6 languages. From 2005 to 2010, Lance was a curator at Harvard University's Three Columns Gallery. Among other shows, he worked on Darkness, Darkness, a traveling exhibition of night photography which opened in 2008. His photographs are in the collections of the Art Complex Museum, the Boston Atheneum, the Boston Public Library, the Grace Museum in Abilene, Texas, which I think I've visited. States, tiny little place with good artwork in it. State Street Bank, Fidelity Investments, Paramount Partners, Hitachi, Rayovac, and 3Com. As an educator, he has taught at the New England School of Photography, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the Photographic Resource Center, and the Houston Center for Photography. Lance leads independent workshops across the country and is a frequent presenter for photographic events nationally and internationally. In 2011, he was featured speaker and workshop instructor at Estudio Brasil in São Paulo and the Scottish Photographers Association in Glasgow. So please help me welcome Lance to our lecture series.
Thank you. Jaime, don't take off yet. Don't leave just yet. I want to present you with the Spanish language version of my book.
Wow, thank you.
So thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you.
I'll sign it for you later if you like.
Definitely.
So hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming out tonight and hearing this talk on night photography. I teach a lot of workshops and classes on the subject of night photography, and usually the lectures and the talks that I'm giving are very much technically oriented how to go out and photograph at night. Tonight I want to talk a little bit more about the history of night photography and show you some images where the genre has come from and how it's evolved. But I think first, just to put everything in a little bit of context, why photograph at night? What makes it different or worth distinguishing from just photography in general? And I think there are a number of reasons for that, a couple of which are just the nature of night photography requires longer exposures. And when you have 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a few hours to do an exposure, it presents a lot of opportunities for things to happen, for transformation. So whether that means, planes flying through your frame or clouds passing overhead or a policeman driving up and shining his headlights straight in your camera saying, "What the hell are you doing?" There's a lot of things that can happen that many times will ruin a photograph, but other times just unexpectedly make it something better than it would have been otherwise. You can also get in and do your own manipulation during those time exposures by adding light or, something as simple as just adding emphasis to part of the foreground by lighting it up. You can choose to add color, and the color that you add will change the mood or the feeling of the image. So you really have a lot of control. There's also there are people who've done multiple self-portraits where one person appears 10 or 20 times in the same image because they move around and are lit during the exposure. Lots and lots of possibilities. You can do quote-unquote night photography in a dark room, in a studio. I've had students that have done really cool stuff just in their home on a tabletop playing around with little pen lights. So there's lots and lots of interesting possibilities. Another thing that makes night photography kind of unique or special is that it gives us the opportunity to kind of step away from the fast pace of our 21st century lives and kind of reconnect with the world around us, whether it's Manhattan or the Grand Canyon, wherever you happen to be. You know, I find that I'm so busy and so focused, like going from point A to point B and checking my emails and doing what I got to do, that I lose track of the amazing world that we live in and just all the really cool stuff that there is to see and perceive. So again, it's those long exposures give you the opportunity to kind of relax and get out of your regular routine and reconnect with the environment. So there's also light. You know, we're used to, for the most part, working with a single light source, either the sun or an overcast sky, a point source or a broad diffuse source, and that's kind of our daytime light source. But at night, you know, you guys walk outside and you see that there are lights all over the place, and they're all different colors, all different kinds of lights, all different intensities and angles. It makes for really, really interesting scenes, especially when you've got more than one light source in the same scene. Sometimes they can be overlapping, or maybe sometimes the foreground's lit with one light and the background with another. So most of the nighttime world, for the time being anyway, is lit with sodium vapor streetlights, which are this kind of real common orangey, not very attractive light. But when you combine that with metal halide lights or mercury vapor lights or even an LED flashlight, you start getting into, you know, like studio lighting and working with color and influencing the way people perceive those photographs based on the colors and the imagery. So I've been photographing at night since 1984, 85. The very first roll of film that I ever shot was in my bedroom with a camera on a tripod, and my girlfriend and I were just kind of playing around, and we'd turn off the lights and playing with the flashlight, drawing and painting with light, and, you know, lighting each other, moving around. And, you know, it was kind of cheesy and not very good, but it was enough to get me interested. And it's been the focus of my photographic work since that time has been working at night, for some of those reasons that I just talked about. And it's really interesting. Throughout the course of that period, when I meet other night photographers and when I read books or magazine articles from other people working at night, there's a lot of commonality that goes through what people have to say about working at night. It's those same things, that the theme of the ritual of creating the images, of senses just coming to life when you're out there and experiencing nature, experiencing the world, the mystery, the solitude, the peacefulness of working at night, all those things. And then taking time and compressing time into something that we couldn't perceive or see with our own eyes. So, you know, you're here listening to me talk, and it's a real-time, continuous thing. But if somebody had set up a camera in the back of the room and was just doing one continuous exposure, the resulting image would be a lot different from what you guys experience when you're here. And that transformation of time and recording it into a way that we can't perceive with our natural senses is one of the things that kind of universal themes of night photography that really kind of get people going. So night photography has been around for a long time. You know, the medium of history of photography is about 175 years old, 170 years old at this point. And the early technology that was available to photographers who in the beginning were mostly scientists and you know, curious people with a lot of money and time to spend. Those materials that they had at their disposal were not very sensitive to light, and photographing at night was really very, very difficult in the early days of photography. However, night photography has been something that people have been interested in and pursuing for a long time. In the course of doing research for the History of Night Photography chapter of my book, I found a lot of historical journal and magazine articles from the turn of the century mostly, where people were discussing night photography, showing their images, and just maybe they were technical articles about the problems of night photography with the equipment available at the day. So this is a guy, A.H. Blake, an English photographer, and he founded the Society of Night Photographers of England in 1910. And I just thought that was the coolest thing when I came across that. Unfortunately, since the internet wasn't around in 1910, there's not much left to learn about these guys, just a couple of magazine articles. But I thought that was really cool, in part because it talks about a community of people all kind of gathering around doing the same thing. And as long as I've been involved in it, that's been something that I really kind of felt very, very good about and really enjoyed that aspect of it. There are people that I met online who were doing night photography back in the 70s or 80s. So many interesting people that when I first had my first website back like 99 or so, people would send me emails from all over the world saying, wow, I thought I was the only one photographing at night. In fact, there's somebody sitting in the back of the room that I'm not sure how Bhavizini and I actually met. I don't remember it anymore, but we were communicating for years before we ever met each other face to face over the subject of night photography. So thanks for coming tonight. Appreciate that. Anyway, so let's look at some images. Hopefully, you guys recognize this. It's what we have come to know as the first photograph. And perhaps a more accurate term would be the oldest extant photograph from life, whatever that means. It means that photography was originally designed to be a Xerox machine. It was conceived of as a way to make copies or prints of artwork or drawings. And Nicephore Niepce, when he was working on this process back in 1826-27, eventually got the idea that he could photograph the real world. So this was a photograph or a representation of a photograph taken from the balcony of his place in France in 1826 or 27. It's at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. Not a night photograph, but why I'm showing it here is just to kind of give us some context. This is the unknown. The length of the exposure is not really known for sure, but it was somewhere in the 8-hour range in sunlight. So imagine if it took 8 hours to expose a single image in sunlight, photographing by moonlight or the non-existent streetlights of the beginning, early 19th century, just impossible. So the first commercially available process was the daguerreotype. And a fellow named John Adams Whipple in Boston worked for 3 years with the Harvard Observatory to be able to photograph the moon on a daguerreotype plate through the telescope. It literally took 3 years of work and lots of experimentation to be able to do this. Daguerreotypes, when they were first introduced in 1839, it took a few minutes to expose an image. Within a few years, it came down to a few seconds in bright sunlight, but it was still incredibly difficult to photograph at night on a daguerreotype plate. Next was the collodion wet plate, glass plate, which had to be coated with emulsion and exposed and then developed before the emulsion dried. So again, it was very insensitive and its feelings were bruised easily. No, it was insensitive to light. It required tremendous amounts of exposure and it just wouldn't really work at night. So it wasn't until the late 1870s with the invention of the dry plate that night photography became possible at all. And I've got a couple of anonymous images here. These are early dry plates from late 1870s. It's a shot of the stars revolving around the North Star. You can point your camera to the north once you get out of the city and repeat this pattern pretty much anywhere in the northern hemisphere. So here's, I'm not sure what the name of this comet, but comet passing by, and the stars here are just appearing as little dashes in the sky, a shorter exposure. So, all right. So while night photography technically became possible in the 1870s, it really wasn't until the turn of the century when it really took off, and there were a number of people who really got interested in it. And the first person who really dedicated a lot of time to night photography was Paul Martin. And he was an English photographer, and he began photographing London at twilight in 1895-96. And those exposures extended, and he kept working into full darkness. It's interesting that Martin tells stories in his autobiography that anybody who's photographed at night could relate to, being followed around by a policeman wondering what he was doing, being frustrated with not cars, but in this case mostly horse and buggies with lanterns being pulled across the frame through his image, and having to cover the lens with his hat while the light source went through the frame. Stuff that we still deal with today. Very first night photographer had the same frustrations. So these images may not be terribly exciting, or they may not be the best quality, but these are from prints made in 1895-96, and really very, very new and exciting. So much so that when Alfred Stieglitz over here in New York got wind of what he was going on, they started a correspondence, and it was Martin's work in London that got Stieglitz interested in photographing at night, and Steichen and Coburn and Paul Haviland and all that circle of pictorialists that were so active here in New York starting about 1910 and going through the teens. I'm not going to talk about those guys so much tonight because their work is pretty well known. I want to show you images by lesser known but really interesting photographers nonetheless. And just give a little bit of, hopefully a little bit of perspective and introduce you to some new work. This is an image by Louis Hine, very well-known photographer. Not somebody that we think of, though, as a night photographer. His social documentary work, working to end child labor at the turn of the century, involved photographing children working at night as messengers or newsboys. Here they're shooting craps out in the street. But he was doing very simple, straightforward photography using light by flash powder. So, remember seeing those old movies and you got the guy holding up the little stick with the bar on it and the explosion? It was magnesium powder that was set on fire, and that was an instantaneous source of light. And that was kind of early sources of light for night photography. But this is a really interesting image, Coney Island, Luna Park, 1905. I came across this image, which unfortunately is only credited to the Detroit Publishing Company. Who took the image, we don't know. But there's a huge 70 megabyte TIFF available for download on the Library of Congress website. Pretty amazing stuff for 1905 to have this kind of beautiful image here. It was on a glass plate. I don't know if it was probably an 8x10 or some similar size like that. Really cool image, but what I have it up here to show you, look at that. You wouldn't suspect it from that, looking at what we just saw, but this is just a small corner of the image. There's hundreds of people in this image. All throughout here are two levels of this kind of tables and promenade. It's just really, really cool. The Library of Congress website is a great resource for historical photographs. Okay. Next photographer I want to talk about is Jessie Tarbox Beals. She is relatively unknown, pretty much an exact contemporary of Stieglitz, lived and died within a year on either end of their lives. There's no evidence that they ever met. Beals definitely went into his gallery here in New York. While Stieglitz was always part of, the art scene and, really highly regarded and very influential, Beals was traveling a different path. She's kind of known by people who know her as the first woman news photographer or the first female photojournalist. She had to work 10 times harder than any man just to be able to survive. But she did. She traveled across the country doing whatever kind of work she could do. She was just one of these force of nature people. She did everything. She chased Teddy Roosevelt around until she could photograph him. She had her husband, who ended up being her darkroom person and did her processing and printing for her. Really, really interesting personality. Albert Allard, Allard, did a biography of Jessie Tarbox Beals. It's worth checking out. Her images, her night images, span her career, mostly from the turn of the century up through the 20s, but a little bit later than that. They're generally not that exciting, not that interesting, but again, she was an early pioneer of night photography and out working in a difficult environment with a large, heavy camera and awkward equipment and glass plates and all that. And she created a pretty substantial body of work. There are a lot of images, existing prints of hers at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. So, again, she's not really well known, but I think she should be. Okay. Juan and Miguel Vargas. It's not Juan.
Miguel is definitely
Miguel and totally blanking out on the brothers name. The Vargas brothers. Thank you. Two Peruvian photographers working in Arequipa, Peru, in the teens and 20s. They had a portrait studio and were kind of part of the bohemian art scene in Arequipa at the time, which was actually a pretty hopping place. There's a lot of artistic activity happening in this area in the teens and 20s, and they were kind of in the forefront of it. They had a very successful portrait studio, but what they really loved to do on their own was photograph at night. And again, they're really not very well known. The only reason that I knew about them was because of my conversations with a fellow named Peter Yen in Houston, who's been researching early 20th century night photographers in general, and these guys in particular. They're true pioneers, and their contribution to night photography is really exceptional. I can't say that they were all that influential because their work didn't really get outside of South America at all until Peter Yen found them. But they were doing things in the teens and 20s that we didn't think anyone did until much later with Bill Brandt in the 1930s. So, what's special about the Vargas brothers, what's unique about these guys, is that they are, number one, they're staging photographs, which had been done before, but they're staging photographs at night, and they're lighting them with aesthetics in mind. They're really thinking about the lighting rather than like Louis Hine just blasting with flash powder just to get enough light to do the work, or just enough light to make an image. These guys were really pre-visualizing their images and thinking about it. And you look at this and you can see the light source is out of the frame behind the bridge. And they've placed this guy here looking that way and another guy looking that way. It's a long exposure. There's star trails up in the sky. They've added this light here. Who knows? It could even be the same guy. I doubt it, but they were just incredibly creative and did a lot of really neat stuff, thinking about lighting and applying it at night. People in a lot of their images too. But I think these images are probably the first ones you really get a sense of, the mood, the romance, the solitude, the loneliness, isolation, just mystery of night photographs. And these guys, they figured that out. You'll notice the rings around all the streetlights there. That's called halation, and it's basically reflection off of the backside of the glass plate. And that was a problem for early night photographers. They always had these halation rings on their glass plates. Eventually, they developed a coating, an anti-halation coating that we to this day have on film. But just one of the many technical problems that early photographers faced. So this image, you could be forgiven for assuming that it was a daytime image. It's very bright. You can see what's going on. But this is made entirely with moonlight. Just really amazing stuff. And this, I think, is really their masterpiece. Just a fantastic image. They've lit from a couple of different positions. They've totally staged it. They've composed it so wonderfully with the mountain underneath the bridge. And it's really orchestrated. So you've got this guy here and the fellow over there that are being lit from behind the bridge, light coming out this way. A group of people back here, and they've got a light either inside the cluster of men there or behind them. Again, you don't see the light source. The light that's lighting these fellows also lights the underside of the bridge. And then you've got these four guys up on the top who have no added light whatsoever. So they're silhouetted, they're just in shadow. But they had to be instructed, this is going to be a half-hour exposure. You guys have to sit really still for half an hour. You can tell it's how long it is by the length of the star trails in the sky. So again, it's a real challenging situation, but it's totally pre-planned and pre-visualized and thought out, and it's just a wonderful image. So it's Carlos. Yeah, Miguel and Carlos Vargas. There we go. Yeah, okay. So back in...
They remind me about what Cruzen's doing most recently, his lighting and how precise he is.
I don't think these guys had quite the budget he did, but yeah, it's that's a pretty good comparison, I think. Definitely a collaborative project. Okay, so now we've hopped back across the pond to Europe. Many people, of course, are familiar with André Cortez, a Hungarian photographer. This is image taken in Budapest, I think in 1909 or 1910. Not really known as a night photographer, but he does have a number of night images in his portfolio, I suppose. Cortez was probably most influential in terms of night photography by introducing his fellow countryman Brassai, who had moved to Paris to become a painter. He introduced Brassai to photography one night when they went out and photographed in Paris. So André Cortez, from about 1910 through the 40s, occasional night images. But again, he was basically the catalyst that got Brassai, probably the best known night photographer of all time, photographing at night. Brassai photographed Paris nightlife, kind of the seedy underbelly of Parisian nightlife in the 30s. And I did say I was going to talk about lesser known photographers, but we have to include him in there just because he was so influential. And many of the other people we're going to look at were inspired or influenced by Brassai's work. Oh, by the way, this is a group of homeless people having a bonfire underneath a bridge on the Seine in Paris. Brassai's images were prostitutes, brothels, cabarets, opium dens, and also, just Parisian scenes like this one here. I've always been drawn to this type of imagery more than his more documentary work. Now, Brassai occasionally used lighting, not very often. It was sometimes, usually just flash powder, for which Picasso gave him the nickname of the terrorist because of the explosive nature of the flash powder. But he basically was a documentary photographer. He photographed what he saw, what he found. He might ask somebody to pose or hold still, but for the most part, he was photographing Parisian nightlife as he observed it. Okay, Bill Brandt, an English contemporary of Brassai, met him, went so far as to copy one of Brassai's images of a Parisian prostitute. Brandt recreated the image in London using his wife as the model for the prostitute. Brandt's work is different in that he staged his images. And that's what I said earlier, that the work that the Vargas brothers were doing in the teens, we didn't think anybody really did that kind of thing until Bill Brandt working in the 30s, but that turned out not to be the case. Still, Brandt did a lot of journalistic photography or news stories, but let me just put it this way. If Photoshop had been invented in the 30s, Bill Brandt would have been a heavy user. He was not opposed to going to any extreme to get his idea across. So rather than lighting out in the field, he was manipulating his images in the darkroom to get the mood that he was looking for. This is a great example of that. This is actually a daytime image that he's just printed really dark and contrasty to make it look like a night shot. Does it matter? Well, I don't know. I think if you're being a journalist, if you call yourself a journalist, maybe you'd certainly cross the line on a number of occasions. But as an artist, I think we're free to do whatever we want. If you want to, Photoshop a bunch of monkeys into your photograph, whatever, that's fine, as long as you don't claim it to be news. Real high contrast images. A lot of Brandt's images were indistinguishable whether they were day or nighttime images. It was hard to tell. He didn't really care that much. He just wanted to get a mood or feeling across. So, very menacing. Another one. Dark and mysterious here. Okay, one of Brandt's better known photographs or projects was photographing the Industrial Revolution mill towns in the north of England in the early 1940s. They were in decline at this point, terribly polluted with coal smoke. And he did a really interesting photographic survey of these mill towns, printing these dramatic high contrast day and night images. And Bill Brandt in turn was hugely influential on fellow countryman Michael Kenna. Anybody know Michael Kenna's work? You guys familiar with him? Okay. All right, well, you need to go and seek him out. Absolute master of contemporary night photography. Michael Kenna, K-E-N-N-A. You can find his original prints at a couple of galleries here in New York. And it's worth, he's a traditional film photographer, does his own printing in the black and white darkroom. It's worth going and seeking out his original prints rather than just looking at them online. This is an early image from the early 80s when he was first getting started retracing Bill Brandt's footsteps. I love the way that the tones reverse. A daytime image, a nighttime image. Some of the tones are completely reversed, except that wall and shadow remains dark in both images. All right. Okay. Now, like the Vargas brothers, John Morrison and Harold Burton are relatively unknown. Again, doing the research for the History of Night Photography chapter of my book, I was trying to track down the copyright holder of their imagery because I really wanted to include one. There were editorial assistants and myself searching and searching and searching all over the internet, trying to figure out who owned the copyright to their work, and we never could. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to include them. But their work, also these guys were very much aware of Bresai's night photography of Paris, and they produced an equally, if not more stunning book of night photographs of London just a year after Bresai's book came out. Like Bresai's book, it was printed in photogravure, this time with a blue tint. Really, really moody and atmospheric images. John Morrison and Harold Burton. I did find one of them did photographs illustrating a children's book, and one of them was killed in World War II, but that was all I could find out about these guys. Just happened to come across this book in a used bookstore in San Francisco a number of years ago, and the book was $150, and I'd never spent that much money on a book before, but couldn't pass it up. It was just, such a gem to find this. So you notice they're photographing largely on foggy nights because it just adds to that mood and atmosphere. Great stuff. You can find copies of this book called London Night, published by Collins in 1934. You can find copies on used booksellers online, and beat up ones in poor condition are only about $20. So they're out there. That's the only place I know of where you can see their work, but it's just spectacular. Oh, got that one in there twice. All right. Oh, and in the introduction to Burton and Morrison's book, they even quote the introduction to Paul Moran's introduction to Bresai's Paris by Night. So that's how we know that they were influenced by him. Same here. We're going to see some images by Volkmar Wenzel, who worked for National Geographic in the 30s, processing and printing. He was a darkroom technician, and inspired by Bresai's Paris by Night, he went out and photographed Washington, D.C. at night, again in bad weather. Foggy, rainy, snowy nights. It just adds to the mood and the atmosphere. So this book, Washington by Night, Volkmar Wenzel, W-E-N-T-Z-E-L, is also available online through Amazon or other booksellers at a pretty reasonable price. This book was published much later, about 1992 or 3. So, okay. So just one image back to Brandt for a minute. Bill Brandt, known for those night images of London in the 30s, contemporary with Bresai, but he also photographed London during the blackouts when the Germans were bombing London in 1941 and 42. He was out, after the air raid sirens went off, wandering the streets, photographing London in the darkness by moonlight. And anybody who knows his work pretty much is familiar with those images. What's lesser known, though, is that Margaret Bork White also photographed London in 1941 in the blackouts. And there's a whole series of those images. She's not really known as a night photographer, but it's just neat to come across these images in this whole other body of work. There's something even more remarkable about her, and we'll see that when we get to the last image, her last image, the Tower Bridge. You see the star trails in there? Okay, here we go. Margaret Bork White was the only foreign journalist behind the Iron Curtain when the Germans started bombing Moscow. She was working for Life magazine, and most people would say she was stuck behind the Iron Curtain, but she wanted to be there. And she initially began photographing the bombing raids from the roof of the American Embassy in Moscow. And so she talks about in her biography, when the air raid siren would go off, she would go up on the roof and set up 3 or 4 4x5 cameras, open the shutter, and then run down into the bomb shelter until the all clear was given, and then go up to the roof and close the shutters. And that's the length of the bombing raid determined the length of the exposures. But this is an example of what that imagery looked like. She stayed in Moscow for quite a while and eventually photographed from the balcony of her hotel room. She even scored a portrait of Stalin. So pretty cool stuff. I think in the upper left-hand corner, that black line, I think that's the cable release that happened to go across the lens during the exposure. No Photoshop on that one. Okay, Alfonso Garcia Sanchez. Probably never heard that name. He was a Spanish photographer, pretty well-known commercial photographer working in Madrid, in post-war Madrid and Spain. He was commissioned by the Spanish government to produce a body of work, and the idea of it was to promote Spain as an exciting and safe place to come visit. I'm not sure that he really achieved that goal. These very dark and ominous images of Madrid, they're wonderful, but as a tourist propaganda mechanism, I'm not sure that they work. But again, really this work isn't very widely known. It was published in a book, which I did manage to find a copy at a library somewhere, and through an interlibrary loan was able to borrow it. Like Brassai's book and like Burton and Morrison's book, it's printed in photogravure. So they're really wonderful, beautiful prints. I don't know, does this look like a vibrant, thriving city to you? This kind of imagery, it's I don't know, it kind of follows a vein of a lot of the work that night photographers have done over the year of these, these atmospheric, quiet cityscapes. From these guys, from the Vargas Brothers up through Michael Kenna. This one reminds me of a Cortez image with the shadow of the light fixture projected on the ground there. There's a Cortez image that's very similar, has a similar pattern like that. Okay, jumping ahead a little bit to the 1970s and 80s. There doesn't seem to have been much night photography activity in the 60s. I think people were just too busy doing other stuff. But the one fellow I did find who did a good body of night photography in the 1960s was William Gedney. And he had night portfolios, you ready for this? From New York, San Francisco, Nebraska, and Calcutta. So really pretty interesting and diverse body of work. His entire collection of work, this is William Gedney, his work is held by Duke University. He had the unfortunate distinction of being one of the first people to die from AIDS. So anyway, moving right along. This is an image, actually a self-portrait of my teacher, whose name is Steve Harper, sleeping for 4.5 hours in his home in San Francisco. It's, I've tried to recreate this about 10 times over the years and just never been able to pull it off. Somehow it's just a lot harder than you would think. So Steve was, as far as I know, the first person to start teaching night photography. In the mid-'80s, when I decided to go to college for photography, I'm looking at all the art schools that offered classes, and I'm trying to find somebody who was teaching night photography. and Steve was the only one. So I moved from Baltimore to San Francisco to study with him at the Academy of Art. Steve Harper influenced and inspired a whole generation of night photographers in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there was a real explosion of interest in night photography in the 1970s with people like Arthur Ullman and Richard Misrak and Steve Fitch and Roger Minnick, probably a whole bunch others that, Jerry Burchard, a lot of, and Michael Kenna too, who was living in San Francisco at the time. So a lot of night photography in the Bay Area. And that tradition continues today with a group called the Nocturnes, founded by my friend Tim Baskerville, which is a night photography organization. It's that community that I was talking about in the beginning. Basically, it's a resource for people to come together and share images and workshops and classes and all kinds of stuff. TheNocturnes.com is that website. So Tim Baskerville, Tom Pava, Troy Pava were all students of Steve Harper. Very famous rock in Yosemite known as Steve's Rock, named by his students who have all kind of emulated his work that he did there. Steve Harper took his night photography classes to Mono Lake and Yosemite in the summer sessions in the early 90s and late 80s. And that was kind of my introduction to that area and really kind of fell in love with the place. So that, this was in West Marin on the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge. This was used for an album cover for a Windham Hill group in the early 80s. I think the album was called Something of Time. Steve was real creative, very curious, and his body of work, if you look at it all together, it's kind of all over the place. He didn't work in themes, you know. He was always trying something different, exploring new things, and he also worked collaboratively with his students. And if any of you guys go out and do night photography, I hope you'll, bring a friend along, because it just adds to the experience. You bounce ideas off each other, help each other focus or light. It's really a nice way of working. And of course, if you're in a less than safe area, it's nice to have somebody watching your back too. So this is Salt Flats in Death Valley. And somehow he convinced one of his students to stand there for what looks to be about a half-hour, 45-minute exposure. Death Valley temperatures get down to 85 or 90 at night, so that explains the shirtless fellow there. 10 minutes, okay. Zabriskie Point in Death Valley. And this is probably Steve's favorite image. He says to him, the experience of being there at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, making this image, he just felt more connected to the world than he ever had in his life. He said for him it summed up, it made him realize the universality of all things. He just felt like the ocean, the blanket that he was holding over his head, flapping in the wind, all the rocks, everything was just all made out of the same stuff. All right, so now we're going to jump ahead, and I want to show you some contemporary work, some really interesting stuff. Light painting perhaps began with these images of Picasso drawing. I forgot to look up the name of this fellow.
John Milley.
Milley, that's right, thank you. This image is pretty well known. People have seen this one. Picasso is drawing this bull in his darkened studio, and then Milley popped a flash on him at the last minute. These images are lesser known, but this is very early light painting, I believe in the late 1930s. Okay, so now let's look at some really interesting contemporary light painting. Now these images I'm going to show you are really very different from the kind of work that I do, but I find them fascinating nonetheless. This is a guy named Dennis Smith, who his website is theballoflight.com, and he specializes in orbs, as you can see. And there are many people, if you look online on Flickr or other websites, you'll see a lot of these images. But this guy more or less started it. I don't know if he invented it, but he certainly perfected the technique, and I think still does the best orbs of light. Dennis Smith. Okay, here's another Dennis. This is Dennis Calvert from Arkansas, of all places. Really creative and playful. Came across this guy's work on Flickr. Dennis Calvert. A lot of jumping silhouettes in his imagery. It's fun to figure out how these were done. Okay, a Finnish photographer named Hannu Huhtamo. He does these very organic, kind of alien plant-like structures, drawing with light, pointing his light source towards the camera in Finland in the winter. Variation on the orb there. And look how different the feeling, the mood of these images are in nature versus in the man-made environment. Unfortunately, like Dennis Smith, Hannu's work is being copied almost, stroke for stroke. I really think it's great to go out and try to figure out what other people have done, but once you figure it out, move on and do something of your own. Because I get frustrated when I see a lot of copycat photography and people claiming, somebody else's ideas as their own. But it's funny, I bring this up because I saw images that I thought were Hannu's, and then looked and it's like, oh no, somebody else. This guy is amazing. Julien Breton. I think he's Moroccan, lives in France, and he is a calligrapher by profession, pen and paper. But he started working with light. The precision of this guy's work is amazing, just amazing. This one in particular is really impressive because it's three-dimensional. Most of them, they're just one plane parallel to the camera. But this one, you can see, it's three-dimensional. He's got these spirals. This light source, he's going and all the way to the back of the room. You can even see a little bit of a silhouette of him holding the light there. Just phenomenal. Who knows how many tries it takes for him to do this? But it's not easy.
You think these are all single exposures?
Yeah. Okay. Tigtab, Australian woman who goes by the name of Tigtab. And she's developed this technique of using stencils for light painting.
What is her name?
Tigtab, T-I-G-T-A-B. Look on Flickr. Really complex work. She says that she spends a couple of months planning a single shot. So these are a stencil with a light shown from behind pointed at the camera from different positions. And it's just remarkable the way she gets them to look as if these lilies are really floating on the water. Just really cool stuff. Now, you could do this in Illustrator or, some kind of drawing program, but the fact that she's done this just with light, I think, is really, really cool. Okay. This is a collaborative image by some of my students taken in an old decrepit fort in Massachusetts, which is one of the locations that I take my Boston students. And I'd love to know if at the end, during the Q&A session, if anybody can figure out what's going on here. All right. Now I'm going to show you just a couple of my own images. This one I guess you've seen before because it was used for the publicity for the program. As Hine said, my work is often where human things kind of intercept with the natural landscape. So where there's evidence of man, you know, I go as far away from civilization as I can in West Texas and Death Valley and Mono Lake and all these really out-of-the-way places. And instead of photographing the natural landscape like this, I'm usually drawn to, you know, signs of human presence. This is Olmsted Point in Yosemite where Steve's Rock is located. Here we go. Betty Boop, this is West Texas. So these images are a combination of moonlight and my own added light with flashlights, maybe one or two different flashlights. All the lighting is done from different positions. So I'm not standing behind the camera lighting the scene. I'm moving around, sometimes in the shot, sometimes just outside the frame. This one, though, the light actually happened to be ambient existing light. It was near, this is a Mexican cemetery in West Texas, and it was near the Day of the Dead, so there were candles on the graves. It's one of my favorite shots. I love these weird little things you find in the desert. This is actually the gatehouse to a trailer park. All-night mariachi band. They were very cooperative, stood there the whole time for me. This is remains of a cinnabar mine in West Texas. Pretty obvious lighting here. And you know, I love the, so you can get a sense of that contrast between the warm light that I've added and the cool moonlight. Short exposure. I believe that's Jupiter up there on the right, the bright spot. I generally use longer exposures and low ISOs, but in this particular case, I really wanted to show that that planet there as a bright point of light. So it meant cranking up the ISO pretty high, probably 1600. It might have been a little bit higher than that, to be able to get a short enough exposure so that the stars didn't move. Burning bush. Very simply lit, just cross-lighting from the left and the right, just outside the frame. This is inside that mine shaft in West Texas. I wanted to make it look like the train is coming down the tracks and kind of throw off the scale of this shaft. It's probably maybe 30 feet from the ground to the ceiling. It's pretty high. But by making it look like the train is smaller, I wanted to seem enormous. This is the other end of the same mine shaft. And in this case, it's 100% added light. It was completely dark in there. So I've got a gas lantern in the back around the corner, a incandescent flashlight on the ladder, and then a flash with a blue gel on the rocks all around. So pretty simple. And it took maybe 4 or 5 tries to get something that I really liked. And that's the beauty of working with digital, is that you see the results right away, and you get to say, well, that didn't work. I can make this better by moving this light a little bit, or a little more, a little less. You know, that's really nice and luxurious to be able to do that. So a lot of the lighting techniques that I use are very similar to what people would do in studio. You know, cross-lighting, backlighting are always make imagery more dramatic. Perspective. Just as during the daytime, perspective makes images interesting. Same is true at night. The camera's about 3 inches off the ground here, and those trees are, you know, knee-high. There's actually burned out mesquite bushes. It's still possible to do really long exposures with digital. Basically, you cheat by taking a series of shorter images and then stacking them together in post-processing. So that's the Sierra looking towards Yosemite. Bodie Ghost Town. Again, this is another stacked image. One single exposure would be, to get that long, would be overexposed, would be too bright. So by doing a series of shorter exposures, I can get the star trails without overexposing the image. There's also that same ghost town. Really cool place. So I like the theatricality of lighting these things, and make them look like a stage set where something's about to happen. You don't know what, but it seems like there's this anticipation that you never know what's going to happen. Most photogenic outhouse I've ever seen. Oh boy. And the Undertaker at Bodie Ghost Town. This is shot through a very dirty window, and it's also lit through very dirty windows on opposite ends of the building. The building is all closed off, can't get inside, but I was able to light, again, cross-light from the left and the right, and shoot through the window straight on there. Very sad, the little child's casket on the right with the little window in there. I don't know what the window's for, because once he's in the ground, it's not a very good view. I think that might be the last image. No, one more. Also in Bodie Ghost Town. This is another high ISO image, I think 6400 ISO. Get that, all those stars and combine it. It's real tough to do a short exposure at high ISO and add lighting, because the lighting just gets blown out immediately. Basically, you have to use a very, very dim or weak flashlight to light something at close range like this. Okay, here's the last one. This is part of the mining equipment at Bodie Ghost Town, and a real popular subject for photography. The thing is, it's about 15 feet across. It's just a lot of fun to work with. Okay, so one of the things that I do is teach workshops and classes on night photography and light painting. And this is a list of the things that I've got coming up in the next year. Trips to Death Valley and Iceland. We're going to be photographing northern lights in March. Night photography at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. This will be, I think, my 5th or 6th time photographing there and doing a workshop in Tarrytown. Bodie, the ghost town that we just saw in July. Real special opportunity to be able to get in there. It's very tightly controlled. And then one of my personal favorite is I do a photo tour to Orkney and Shetland, the northern isles of Scotland, every summer. Wonderful, wonderful places. So my website, you can see up there, The Night Sky with an E, thenightsky.com. I've got a mailing list on there, and you can sign up for that, see some images, and just, send me a link to your images too. I love to connect with people and see what others are doing. So, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, we have time for a couple questions. Hi, my name is Randy, and I would like to know what's your technique to get rid of the noise on those high ISO shots?
It's partially a matter of what you're using to photograph with. So newer cameras are going to have much lower noise levels than cameras, say, that were made before about 2008. So I'm working with a 5D Mark II. If you're shooting with a Mark II or a Mark III, or not even a full-frame camera, the Nikon D7000 is an awesome camera with very low noise levels. The technology that makes a difference, but I don't have any special, magic that I use. Basically, the in-camera noise reduction on Canon cameras combined with post-processing in Lightroom is all the noise reduction I need. Now, a 6400 ISO image, I'm not going to print to 40 by 60 inches. So I'll go as probably 20 by 30 is as large as I would feel comfortable with. But you have to find the sweet spot of how much noise is acceptable to you at what print size. So if I'm shooting at 100 ISO, I can make 40 by 60 inch prints from my Mark II. If I'm shooting a 1600, maybe I could get away with 30 by 40, 30 by 45. 6400, pushing it to 20 by 30. I do like to print large. There's still all these third-party noise reduction softwares out there, but you really don't need them anymore with the noise reduction that's built into Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. But if you're using a point-and-shoot camera or you're using a DSLR from 2004, you're going to have a lot of noise, and there's not a whole lot you can do with it. So, anybody else? Questions? Hey, Mike.
I'm finding that in a lot of my skies and my night shots, I'm getting a halo or pixelation that kind of graduates a little bit or kind of dissipates a little bit. It's real strong almost throughout the whole frame. I was wondering if that's common
Where are you seeing that?
in the sky.
And on screen or in prints, both?
Both. Not as much in prints, but more so on the computer monitor.
Does it change if you look at the image at full size? If you zoom in
Yeah.
and see it all the
Yeah.
way?
It does. I have seen it in print as well, though.
Yeah.
Not as drastic.
Yeah, I mean, typically when you see that, it's just a matter of the way the image is rendered with all that compressed information on the screen. If you're seeing it prints, I'm not really sure what's going on. What camera are you shooting with?
3100 Nikon.
You shouldn't have that problem.
Okay.
Sounds more like banding to me.
It's kind of like posterization is what I'm thinking of. That's that kind of effect that I see sometimes in skies.
You get it a lot from light globes or radiating from large light scenes. Or
Send me one so I can see it. Try to figure it out. And thanks for coming all the way down from Boston, by the way. Thanks to everybody who came from a distance. I know there are a number of folks here, so appreciate that.
I know it's really warm. Does anybody besides the first row have a question? Working our way back. Oh, way in the back.
Please.
Hi, my name is Robert. Is there any way to determine whether a picture has been stacked? I know you mentioned that that's a technique that you use. Are there any tells that you can
Telltale
determine?
signs of stacking.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. If you have a little tiny JPEG, you probably won't be able to tell. But if you're looking at a high resolution image or a print, look at the star trails, and you may see a slight gapping in between the exposures. And it's not due to the time or the time in between exposures, but just the way the digital images are encoded and processed. That it's one of the problems that we haven't been able to figure out yet is how to resolve those little gaps in between stars on stacked images. But I'm curious why you asked that question.
I was just curious because you know what those images are, but looking through your book, perhaps we might not be able to determine what images were produced in what fashion.
Right. Well, generally, the main reason you would want to stack or combine images would be if you wanted to have long star trails. So if you're looking at digital images that have considerably long star trails that you think are more than 20 or 30 minutes, chances are it's been stacked.
Is there a certain program that you use?
Yeah, I'm glad you
do
asked that question. There is a free script written by Russell Brown at Adobe called Stackomatic. And it is the best way to do stacking of images because it allows you to work with the raw files. There's a lot of stacking applications out there. Most of them are fairly inexpensive, but they mostly only work with JPEGs. So it's kind of nice to be able to have the raw files, put them together, and then rendered as a 16-bit TIFF or PSD, and you can preserve the layers. Most of the stacking applications just close it as one, the finished image is just one stack. So for example, why would you want to do that? Say there was a plane that went through one frame. You could go back and mask that out. Or a car drove through in the distance and you wanted to get rid of that. You could mask it out and it wouldn't make it a difference because you've got all the other images with the background to burn through. So Russell Brown's Stack-O-Matic, I've got a link to it on my website. On the books page, the bottom right-hand corner of the books page, there's like some downloadable information. That's a good thing to point out too. A couple of magazine articles and some technical articles that you can download for free from thenightsky.com/books, lower right-hand side. And speaking of the book is Night Photography, Finding Your Way in the Dark. It's available on my website or in Amazon or in bookstores. Due for an upgrade. It came out in 2010, and I talk about Lightroom 2, so you can tell it's due for an upgrade. But the information is still mostly pretty relevant, and I think it's a pretty good resource for both technical night photography and also, looking at images and talking about the aesthetics of night photography. There's that history chapter, and also a bunch of guest sections by a lot of different photographers who specialize in particular parts of night photography. Anyway, just the shameless commerce division of this presentation. So, any other questions? Yes, in the back there.
We have to get the mic for the tape.
You talk about how using a flashlight
Yeah.
for when you're illuminating the subjects in the foreground. What's your decision to use that instead of, say, low power on a flash? Do you feel it's more controllable?
Okay, so the question is, why use flashlight over strobe? I like the control and the localization and the portability of flashlight. You can certainly do both, and on occasion I will use flash if I want a broad, even source of light, like light up a whole wall. But with flashlight and a snoot on the flashlight, I can, I could light your face from across the room and have it not spill out anywhere else. And it's just, it comes naturally to me. I like the organic way of, dancing around in the shot, waving a light. It's more fun than flash. But, there are other night photographers who use mainly strobe. They certainly both work. So,
All right. Well, I want to thank Lance for a really fascinating, very erudite history of night photography.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. I appreciate it.